right, welcome everyone to the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics Spring 2025 Speaker Series. I'm Todd Haw, Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School and the Faculty Director of the ICGE and Ethical Systems. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by our moderator, Lori Bosker, who will introduce our speaker, Lauren Cunningham, and her talk, More Than Compliance, Rethinking How Corporate Governance is Evaluated, in just a moment. But before I turn things over to Lori, I'd like to say just a quick word about the ICGE and ethical systems. So the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics was reimagined and relaunched earlier this year with the aim of taking a broader, more interdisciplinary, and more systems-based approach to corporate governance and ethics research. Not only did we want to ensure that we were considering corporate governance in its full scope, including the kind of traditional research areas of finance and management, but also corporate law, corporate compliance, business and behavioral ethics, and financial controls. But we also wanted to make sure that research was more accessible to business practitioners. So as part of that relaunch, the ICGE brought ethical systems to the Kelley School, which doubled the number of our faculty affiliates and created an entirely new network of collaborators under the ICG umbrella, as well as a new platform to reach business leaders. So bringing the ICGE and ethical systems together has created a one-of-a-kind institution that is able to harness the best academic research to aid scholars, policymakers, and business leaders, current and future, so that includes students as well, in elevating corporate governance and ethical business practices within their companies. And this speaker series is just one of the ways that we're doing that. So please check out our websites and social media for all kinds of new initiatives and activities coming from the ICG and ethical systems in the future. So now let me introduce our moderator for today, and that is my colleague and ICGE Research Director, Lori Bosker. Lori is an Associate Professor of Accounting and the Arthur M. Weimer Faculty Fellow at the Kelley School. She earned her PhD in accounting from the Georgia Institute of Technology after a BS and MPA in accounting from the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater. Prior to joining academia, Lori worked in public accounting as an auditor at Deloitte. And as a researcher, Lori specializes in behavioral auditing research and focuses on topics such as audit quality, assurance, audit regulation, internal controls audits, and professional skepticism. Her research has been published in a number of prestigious journals, including the Journal of Accounting Research, the Accounting Review, and Contemporary Accounting Research, among many others. And Lori is also an editor at Auditing, a journal of practice and theory, and at Accounting Horizons. Lori, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Todd, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Lauren Cunningham, who will be talking with us about evaluating corporate governance. Lauren is the Keith Stanga Professor of Accounting at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She earned her PhD in accounting at the University of Arkansas, and prior to that, she practiced as a CPA and was a public company audit manager at Grant Thornton. She currently serves as the Director of Research for the C. Warren Neal Corporate Governance Center and the coordinator of the Neal CGC Governance Insight Speaker Series, which hosts corporate executives, board members, regulators, and other industry leaders. Lauren specializes in archival and qualitative research related to audit, corporate governance, and regulatory oversight, and she's collaborated with the Center for Audit Quality, the Institute of Internal Auditors, and published in several leading accounting journals. Her research has been highlighted in news articles, podcasts, blog posts, presented at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. She serves on the editorial board for several leading accounting journals and is an editor at Accounting Horizons, a journal that aims to bridge the gap between research and practice. So before I turn it over to Lauren, I would just like to invite you all to share your questions in the chat. I'll monitor the chat and we'll be sure to pause throughout the presentation for questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Lauren.
Thanks so much. All right, let me get everything shared here. It's always a joy testing out new technology right at the beginning of a presentation. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm really honored. And Todd, all of those things that you said you're hoping that the center takes with an interdisciplinary view, I hope that this topic today can have an interdisciplinary view to its questions and maybe reflections that people can take away afterwards. And so I've titled it More Than Compliance, Rethinking How Corporate Governance is Evaluated. So there's three things that I'd like to cover today, and it's my views. So I'm going to talk about some of my collaborators here in a little bit, but don't blame them if there's something that you disagree with today. So the first is, what is corporate governance? You know, it's kind of a funny thing to be at a corporate governance research speaker series and say, what is that thing that we're all talking about? Then the core of the presentation is really around, okay, so then what could we be doing to evaluate it? And here I'm going to emphasize that background that Lori already alluded to, the auditor background. And then we do have some field study evidence on how internal auditors have been trying to do this and kind of what challenges they've experienced so far. And so that could help shed some light on what challenges you might expect to see if you try to evaluate corporate governance at your company. So diving in, that perspective that Lori kind of already mentioned, that I was in external auditing before I started out. So I've now got 20 years of experience either thinking about being an external auditor, researching external auditors, or researching corporate governance. Some of that research has used field study methods with interviews. And so in total, about 88 interviews so far. That's involved audit committee members, chief audit executives, general counsels, and investors of publicly traded companies. I also got to work with some survey data that the Institute of Internal Auditors had collected. We collaborated on a project called the American Corporate Governance Index. And so those responses were, we created survey questions asking chief audit executives to help us measure and assess what corporate governance health looks like in the US. To give you a feel for some of the projects I've worked on, kind of what frames my comments that you're going to hear today, the first is that when we wanted to do that project with the IIA, the American Corporate Governance Index, we realized that there really wasn't one commonly accepted framework of corporate governance in the US. And if you talk to different people, you kind of get a different definition of what corporate governance might be. So before we can measure something, we first have to define it. We started with a project called Guiding Principles of Corporate Governance. That's still available on our NEO Corporate Governance website if you're interested. It is a bit older now, but I think a lot of the principles still apply to today's view of corporate governance. In that, what we did was we tried to go out and compile common beliefs about corporate governance in the US. So if you run it through a plagiarism checker and you think something looks familiar, I hope it does. That was the goal. The goal was not to be overly innovative in that regard. The goal was to say, hey, if we don't have a current framework, what at least are the things that lots of people are agreeing on? So then once we can define what corporate governance is, we created survey questions that we felt would allow chief audit executives in an anonymous, honest way to kind of talk about their companies. You know, that was a fascinating project. I'm sad that it stopped. One of my favorite findings from that project series was that about 10% of chief audit executives gave their companies a failing score on corporate governance. So while lots of chief audit executives felt comfortable with what their companies are doing, not everything was rosy. And so then that launched a series of academic projects that I've really enjoyed working on. And the focus of today's presentation is around one called Evaluating Corporate Governance, Guiding Principles and Calls for Future Research. I'm also going to sprinkle in some findings from a different project called Challenges in Evaluating Corporate Governance, evidence from chief audit executives. And then we might run out of time, but if we've got time, I also will give a brief overview of some findings that we had on a project related to audit committees evolving oversights. That involved a project with the Center for Audit Quality called Audit Committee, the Kitchen Sink of the Board, and then also two other separate academic studies. And so in that regard, I want to make sure I give thanks to my collaborators on those different research projects. My views today are informed by having challenging conversations with each of them, you know, where we kind of pick around and figure out what's working, what's not, what's clear, what's not. And so I thank all of them: Christy Hain, Terry Neal, Sarah Stein, Kim Walker, and Carnisha Wolf. Okay, so with that, today we're going to try something new. So if it doesn't work, you can blame it on me. I asked them if we could do some polling questions. And you might see it as a series of 3 questions at once. If so, that's great. Go ahead and answer all 3. You might see it as just this first one. So if we can try to launch, perfect. Okay, great. I see poll question number 1. Which best describes how you think of corporate governance? So single choice. Do you think it relates to formal legal requirements established by listing exchanges, contracts, etc.? Do you think it's tone at the top and how the board of directors oversees senior management in the organization? Do you think it goes deeper than that? And if you think it goes deeper than that, I've got 2 options for you. So those last 2 options are kind of related. On the first one, I'm asking, do you think it's structured? Do you think it's measurable? Do you think it's testable? And then that last one, this would be kind of a catch-all. Corporate governance goes deeper than the board level, but it's squishy. It's hard to measure, kind of this, I don't know how to say what it is, but, it's all of those things. All right, and how's that looking? Do we have any results back on that yet? Okay, all right. So it looks like the majority of the audience is going with that last one, that last choice. The very first choice is a view that I hear often from general counsels and maybe some law scholars in the room. The second one even is something that I hear from a lot of finance scholars and accounting scholars. Corporate governance kind of stops at the board level because there becomes this disagreement about these 2 words that I hear a lot. The first word is corporate governance. That's what we're here to talk about today. But then sometimes I hear this carve out word called internal governance. And so some people might say that those last 2 options relate to internal governance. I'm happy to see that the audience here today thinks of corporate governance as kind of all the way going throughout, something that permeates throughout the organization, because that's my view of it as well. All right, so I'm going to close those polling question results on my end. When we interviewed chief audit executives, we did this in order to first do that survey. We wanted to make sure that if we asked survey questions of chief audit executives, it was something that related to their daily tasks, something they'd be comfortable answering. And so we asked them, okay, how do you define corporate governance? What does corporate governance mean to you? And so 5 major themes jumped out at us there. A lot of chief audit executives reference this idea of balancing both shareholder and stakeholder needs. There's been lots of debate about shareholder stakeholder theory and kind of who should take precedent. There's different legal theories involved there as well. So that perhaps is not surprising. I loved this one. Several people talked about corporate governance as that thing that, the squishy thing that helps companies avoid surprises. But it also needs to make sure that it's helping companies stay innovative. It needs to help companies stay nimble. So they don't want corporate governance to be this thing that's viewed as exhaustive of innovation or stifling of trying to take risks, because the goal is not to reduce risk to 0. The goal is to define a tolerable risk level, and that involves governance risk. Define a tolerable level of risk related to what corporate governance policies you want to put in place, and then decide, is that working or not working? So something that we very regularly hear about in corporate governance is this idea of compliance. There are very specific things that are legally required, or they're required by listing exchange requirements. They're required by state laws and regulations around incorporation. That absolutely has to be the foundation of corporate governance when what we're thinking about it. But the goal of today is not to get rid of that mindset. The goal is to push past that mindset. So what else could we add to our view of corporate governance? That would then involve things like tone at the top, setting the right foundation for the culture of the company. And it's also about checks and balances. Are we holding decision makers accountable? And so working with the IIA, the Neal Corporate Governance Center, we've kind of adopted this view of it. So we've defined corporate governance as an overarching set of policies, procedures, and relationships that enable an organization to establish objectives, set ethical boundaries to the acceptable means with which those objectives will be met, monitor the achievement of objectives, reward successful achievements, discipline unsuccessful or inappropriate attempts to meet those objectives. And all of this together is in order to keep the organization aligned with the needs and interests of its primary stakeholders. And when we first wrote this definition, we debated a long time about whether to put the word shareholders or stakeholders right there at the end. And our view is that governance is not one size fits all for everybody. There are different types of entities, different types of publicly traded companies have different ownership structures. They've got, maybe different debt to equity ratios, things like that. So we wanted to say primary stakeholders on purpose. To add a little bit more flavor to what that might mean, I thought it might help to give some examples using kind of a top-down risk-based approach. This is something you hear from auditors a lot. Let's start at the top, let's work our way down. So if we think about corporate governance, I would define the very top as legal structures and relationships with stakeholders. And so some of the questions I might be thinking about are, what type of anti-takeover provisions are in place to protect the company during economic slowdowns? Who are the company's key stakeholders? Are they satisfied with a company's long-term strategy? Do they have, meaning those key stakeholders, opportunities to engage with management and the board? And then where we often see research focused is on this board oversight level. Here, I'd like to dive deeper than just how many meetings were attended. What do the demographics look like? Are they complying with disclosure requirements in the proxy statement? Instead, I'm interested in things like, what's the quality of information that's given to the board? The board is limited in their ability to oversee based on what's given to them. Do they have adequate time to prepare? Is management sending them a pre-read deck that is 400 pages long less than 48 hours before a meeting? Are they effectively challenging management? Is the meeting so jam-packed with agenda items that there's no time to substantively discuss? Now, at a lot of companies, they want the substantive discussions to actually happen before the meeting so that you can kind of dive in deep. And so here, it's also important to understand the culture of how board oversight works at a company. Is this a board that wants more formal interactions during formal meetings, or are they a board that wants to make sure they're collaborating with management to help get the company to the best solution overall? If so, we need to think about how does that work that's observable and not observable? And then are they qualified to provide guidance? I think nowadays, post-SOX especially, this is something that we think to ourselves, yeah, most people are qualified. We have a pretty deep bench of people interested in being a director. We've got entire industries built around that matching process, helping companies find the right directors. And so here I'd challenge it to be company specific, risk specific. So not just are they qualified on average, but are they qualified for the specific risks at this specific company? Now, here's where we're going to start diving deeper. And I love seeing that polling question result that you're kind of thinking the same thing I am. So when I hit that executive management level and I'm thinking about the word corporate governance, the type of things I'm thinking about are, what tone are they setting for the company? Are they willing to hear bad news and constructively solve problems? Are the compensation incentives assigned to those executive management members appropriate? And again, thinking about the definition of corporate governance, based on the ethical parameters that we want this company to operate under. And then as we're pushing down into middle management, it becomes an issue of how deeply is that tone at the top permeating throughout the organization. So are the company's values and ethics surviving that leap from the C-suite to that middle management level? What type of pressures are middle management putting on their workers? How do they react to bad news? Do employees feel comfortable stepping forward if something's going wrong? Because inevitably things are always going to go wrong. There's humans involved here. So corporate governance is all about setting that tone that we want people coming forward in a timely manner when issues are there. And then there's governance structures in place to get the right information to the right people, to work through those issues together. And so then that means at the operational level, you're taking a moment to reflect. You've thought about the top of the organization all the way down. At the end of the day, what are those governance features that are going to be effective at ensuring that the daily operations are consistently performed in accordance with company policies and guidelines, including those ethical parameters? All right, so Lori, I promised I'd put lots of pause points in there for Q&A today. This would probably be the first good one.
All right, great. Thank you, Lauren. That's super interesting. I'm going to take you back a second thinking about some of these kind of major issues with evaluating corporate governance. I read through your Accounting Horizons paper. which I'd recommend everybody to read through. We'll definitely get that shared to the audience. And in there, it's like a bit disheartening to hear that very few public companies are kind of evaluating their system of corporate governance annually.
Yeah.
It's to be sometimes more symbolic and kind of, limited to compliance. So I was curious, like from all the conversations that you had with these different parties, like the audit executives and others, like, are you getting a sense that they really share these beliefs and are really share these concerns? And then did you see any differences across the types of members that you interviewed or heard from? And then,
Yeah, or sorry,
go
keep
ahead.
going.
No, please go ahead.
No, good. I'll forget that if it's three-part question, I'll forget it. So on the differing views, I would say it depends on who you're talking to. So when we first reached out to chief audit executives and kind of learned that they were evaluating corporate governance on maybe a piecemeal basis, so kind of thinking about their normal internal audit plans and that word internal governance versus corporate governance, they probably were already picking up pieces of overall corporate governance. But what they weren't doing were making sure they were systematically getting through it. They weren't bringing it back to the core objectives of the company itself. They weren't drawing those overall conclusions. And so that's what led us to believe, they're really not systematically evaluating corporate governance. So when we started the peer review process, one of the first questions we got was, okay, well, why did you even talk to chief audit executives? Why should they have anything to do with this at all? And the fact is that IIA standards have standards out there that say internal auditors should be evaluating governance. They should be evaluating corporate governance. And the standards provide a bit of a framework for how that might happen, but it's also vague enough that there's a lot of variation in implementation. Then they said, okay, to address the peer review comments, we started reaching out to general counsels, more law scholars, people like that. And they came back with, okay, well, if corporate governance is about compliance with laws and regulations, that comes down to the compliance checklist. Do you have all the things that you need in place to comply with your listing exchange requirements? Are you putting the things in the proxy disclosure that you're required to, et cetera? But what we were pushing for, and this is what we heard from internal auditors that they want to do, is think about governance more as this global big picture thing like the audience members today were. They would love to evaluate corporate governance more thoroughly. So to get back to your question, and chief audit executives would like this to be something that they're doing. At the end of today's presentation, I'll go into some of the challenges that we think kind of prevents them from doing so right now. And then the last one that I'll point to is the board members. Board members want to know if they're doing well or not. Board members that we've talked to love receiving feedback because they are people who have already left maybe their primary careers. This is now their second career. They have the time to be thinking about this. They have the time to be challenging themselves. A lot of the directors we spoke with are highly intellectually stimulating conversations in terms of, okay, how can we be doing this better? If I'm spending all this time at this company and I have risk to myself personally as a director, I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. So I think there's also a disconnect where chief audit executives might be scared to come forward and tell the board, you're not doing something maybe as well as you could. But we heard directors that soak that up and they say, okay, tell us. We just want to be better. So Lori, does that help answer your question?
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience thinking
Okay.
about frameworks. So we have a lot of European audience members on, and one of them was asking about in Europe, they kind of start with the legal requirements. Is that kind of similar in the US, or do we not really have like an overall legal requirement that all companies have to comply with? So are you?
And yeah, I'd be afraid to answer that as an accounting scholar. I know in the governance. So Todd, you laughed at that. So I think I'd save that question for the law scholars. But my understanding is also would go by entity type, et cetera. When we were creating our guiding principles of corporate governance, we looked at a lot of things. Like in the UK, they have a code. South Africa, they have a code. In Canada, they have some things. So we did look internationally when we were trying to think about, okay, what then seems to resonate. We looked at Business Roundtable, some of their commentary, NACD, some of their guidelines. And so I think I'll have to pause on that one otherwise, Lori.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And then just the last thing I was going to
Yeah.
touch base here is, did you notice any trends or did you hear about any trends? Like, to me, it seems like we have expanded kind of reporting disclosures with ESG
Mhm.
reporting and things like that. So my perception is that we've been on an increasing trend with reporting and evaluating, but are we seeing, do you think that trend is correct in terms of really getting at these underlying issues versus like just the compliance check the box? Like, what do you think
Yeah.
about the trend?
No, it's a great point. I'm glad you brought it back to ESG and sustainability. I do feel like anecdotally, I don't have systematic evidence on this, but anecdotally, it did feel like things were kind of picking up and people talking more substantively about this topic, not just that check the box mentality. I'm curious to see in the current, year 2025, will that continue or not? As far as other trends where I do have data points involved, we did collect that data with the ACGI from 2019 to 2021, and we did see a positive improvement. Our last principle is, do you evaluate corporate governance at your entity, essentially? So we don't think you can have, um, you know, guidelines of corporate governance unless you're taking a moment to reflect and kind of that full cycle loop. Let's first define what is corporate governance at this company, but then is it doing what we want it to do? And we did see improvements in that last principle over time. Yeah. All right, so how about I head on to the next area? We've got our next polling question for the audience here. So this is polling question number 2. I'm curious, and it depends on the audience today to what extent we'll see much variation. So the question is, how does your organization monitor and evaluate corporate governance? For the academics in the room, I threw in kind of an I don't know at the end. So that could be I don't know because I'm not at an organization that's evaluating it. It could be I'm at an organization, but I just don't know. But otherwise, what I'm interested in is, are you formally evaluating the full system annually? Are you formally evaluating the full system less than annually? Maybe you formally evaluate individual parts of corporate governance, but you don't kind of, that thing I talked about, you don't pull it back all together into a comprehensive conclusion. Or maybe you don't evaluate it. Like, this is not something you're trying to formally evaluate. Instead, you're just looking at what are trends at peers. What are changes in laws and regulations? What are the types of shareholder proposals I've been getting recently? What does engagement look like with shareholders? See where we are on that one. Okay, so I'm seeing a bit of a mix here. That the I don't know could be part of the students, the academics, and the audience. So I'm going to ignore that for a second. And I'm seeing quite a bit of variation. Okay, great. So thanks for everybody's participation today. Let me show you what we heard from survey results. Lori alluded to these just a little bit ago. So Lori, you set this up perfectly. So what we found when we surveyed chief audit executives, and I didn't give them that third choice of, kind of piecemeal. So you don't see that broken into 4 options here, just 3. But what we found is that 16% of chief audit executives said that their company is formally evaluating the full system of corporate governance on an annual basis. And remember, those IIA standards do have governance in there. So that's why it made sense to us that we would expect to see this at some amount. 25%, so about a quarter of survey respondents said that they do evaluate the full system of corporate governance, but they do so less frequently than annually. But the majority, 57% of survey respondents over the years 2019 to 2021, they just said they keep an informal eye on corporate governance. And that's what we were, that last choice before I don't know about. You kind of chat with peers when you go to conferences, you're reading what's in blog posts and kind of best practices. You're going to conferences, you're checking out laws and regulations changes. And so that's what made us think when we were talking to chief audit executives about, okay, so now how do you go about evaluating corporate governance? We first started by trying to understand, are they doing it? How are they doing it? What does that look like? And so even though survey responses said that a lot of chief audit executives claim to be evaluating the full system of corporate governance in survey responses, our interview evidence would suggest that that's probably not our same definition of systematic or comprehensive. So it tends to be pretty piecemeal. If conclusions are made about how things come together, it's not going to be something that ties back to the corporate objectives themselves. So it's not that full cycle that we'd like to see. And so that really pushed my colleagues and I to write a paper about, okay, so what are those guiding principles for evaluating corporate governance? Because we heard from our participants that they felt like this is a gap out there. They don't have a lot of resources to help them think about how to do this. And so a lot of these opinions in this paper that Lori suggested you all read, thanks for that, Lori, are driven by the input that we got from chief audit executives, but it's also layering in our own opinion of 4 different governance scholars. And so what we came up with is that step 1 is an opportunity to define company-specific objectives of corporate governance. Step 2 is an opportunity to identify relevant governance frameworks. We're going to talk about why that's important. Step 3 is conducting the actual audit plan. And then step 4 is concluding on that overall system of corporate governance. Now, if you're an audience member, either live, watching this later, and you're an auditor, you're going to think, wow, this looks exactly like every other audit plan I came up with. And that's the point. Again, the idea was not to innovate some brand new way of evaluating something. The idea was, let's take the mindset that we already have anytime we audit anything, and let's just apply it to corporate governance specifically. So breaking that down, defining corporate governance. The reason that this is a really important first step is that governance is not one size fits all. You have to think about company specific risks. You have to think about the legal requirements. You have to think about listing exchange requirements. That company's specific stakeholders, their key stakeholders, what are their expectations? And before you can move forward in an effort to evaluate corporate governance, you have to come up with an internal agreement. So at the company, working with all the key stakeholders within the company, so that would be the board, executive management, whoever's going to be on the evaluation team, what do we all agree are the objectives of corporate governance at this company? That then sets the scope of the evaluation. It's important to agree first in the beginning, because if later the evaluation team starts making findings, so they find things that need improvement, that either it's a strict compliance issue that someone's not in compliance with something, or it's more about that soft touch. Like governance is in essence there on a check the box basis, but nothing effective is coming out of that governance process. So if you start coming up with findings later on, but you didn't agree that that was in scope for the evaluation, people are going to challenge you and say, okay, well, why'd you even look at that in the first place? You know, why do you think that's corporate governance? And so this evaluation needs to be tailored to the company. And if limited resources exist, you could pre-agree on, okay, these are where we think governance risks are the highest. So a lot of evaluations focus on the key risks within that area. They're not trying to tackle every single thing that happens in that area. Same thing should apply in a corporate governance evaluation. And so moving on to step 2, once you know at this specific company what we think governance objectives should be, you then have to know, okay, so at what point do I decide that given those objectives that we want to achieve from a corporate governance perspective, how do we know that our corporate governance is good enough? Well, that's where frameworks come into play. And in the US, there's not a commonly accepted framework of corporate governance. There are in other countries, there's not in the US. And so this is a major challenge that chief audit executives have run into when they have attempted to evaluate corporate governance. And I love this quote. A chief audit executive told us, you know, the thing that we have to deal with typically as a chief audit executive is, you did this assessment, but against what? What did you assess us against? Why did you choose this thing? So similar to the importance of upfront getting everybody to buy in on the idea of the scope of corporate governance, everybody should agree, what are you going to be evaluated against? What is the benchmark? What is the framework? What does that look like? Now, some good news on this front, if you haven't been following this area, recently, COSO and the NACD issued a request for a proposal to develop a corporate governance framework in the US. I'm extremely excited about this. PwC won the contract. They're working on it this year. I think we should be able to see something either later this year, early next year, hopefully, on what they've kind of come up with. I can't wait to see it. I want to see their definition of corporate governance. I want to see how detailed they're going to get. I want to see, you know, to what extent do they decide corporate governance is legal versus it permeates throughout the organization. So before we get there and you can tell I'm excited about it, what can you do in the meantime? Well, in the meantime, what we heard from chief audit executives is that there's a variety of things that they kind of cobbled together to come up with a company specific framework of corporate governance. They use those IIA professional standards about governance evaluation. They use COSO's internal control framework. They use COSO's enterprise risk management framework, ISACA or NIST maturity and governance frameworks. They said have some really nice components to them. And then NACD guidelines. I imagine the PwC is looking at a variety of these things for coming up with how they're going to recommend frameworking it in the US. And then step 3. Okay, we've all agreed on what objectives we think corporate governance is trying to achieve at this company. We all agree that we're going to benchmark against this specific framework or against this set of peers. This is your opportunity to specifically define, and you don't do this in whole, you are going to break it down by objective or by risk. Okay, what does good or bad governance look like specific to this objective? And then you go seek out evidence in both directions. You, as an auditor, you can't only seek out confirmatory evidence. You also need to be looking for contradictory evidence, and we need to do the exact same thing in a governance evaluation. So anyone that's going to do a governance evaluation, they can leverage a lot of existing things. So public and private information alike is out there. So you've got company strategy, you've got the mission statement, value statement. Boards and committees are probably already doing annual, if not biannual, self-evaluations. Get access to those. There's going to be a lot of whistleblower hotline activity, hopefully. You know, one of my favorite quotes from an audit executive was, if there is no activity on the whistleblower hotline, that's actually your biggest red flag that you've got a culture problem. If people aren't willing to call in, that means they're scared of something. So people expect there to be activity on a whistleblower hotline. It's all about, how does that get resolved? How timely does it get resolved? You know, what root cause analysis is done after something is reported? And then social media and press activity, all those stakeholders that are interacting with the company on a daily basis, what are they saying that could shed light on what corporate governance is and is not doing at this company? A lot of these things, though, are going to be surface level for thinking about corporate governance. And so you're likely going to want to conduct interviews and surveys to get at the idea of substance over form. This is pushing past that compliance activity. And so I laid out some examples here of what that might look like. So in board oversight, if we think about a compliance view of board oversight, I might think about meeting attendance. What percent of directors attended the meeting? I might think about complying with charters. So let's go look at the committee agendas for the year, and did everything on the charter get checked off at some point during the year? I might think about proxy disclosure requirements. So the company has a specific policy. Let's say CEO chair duality is one that people love to pick on. You know, what did I disclose, you know, the fact that there is CEO chair duality at this company, and, you know, can I give my stakeholders a feel for why I chose that at the company? Now, those are all things of check, check, check. But substantively, I could push that further. You know, let's think about what's happening during the meetings. Are heads just nodding? You know, what types of questions are board members asking? Both the board and executive management, how are they talking about those stakeholders? When you think about something like CEO chair duality, this is why we chose this policy for corporate governance. Now let's step back to see, is it achieving what we thought it should? Is it working the way that we thought it should? Another example is incentive structures. So it's not just about looking at a contract, who approved it, signature is there, check, compliance, we got someone to approve the incentive contract. No, instead it's, okay, what type of governance was present in designing this? Who was involved? What challenges were made? What type of benchmarking was done? Did we use consultants? Were those consultants independent and someone that we can trust to provide objective viewpoints? Are there any signs that the people who were then given those executive contracts are manipulating benchmarking in order to earn their payouts? And then corporate culture, you can't talk about corporate governance without talking about corporate culture. I mean, it's just absolutely embedded. This is an opportunity to be a fly on the wall at various locations to kind of feel out, you know, these are quotes because this is things that chief audit executive said to us. I love these phrases, you know, mood at the middle, buzz at the bottom. If you know what the board and the executive team is claiming tone at the top to be, this is, if you interview board members, if you interview executives and you ask them, what is this corporate culture like? See if they're talking about it the same way. Then go down to the operational level and see if they're talking about it the same way. Is it really permeating throughout the organization? Here, the auditor in me wants to absolutely forewarn you, you will find failures when you do a governance evaluation. I hope you find failures because there are human beings involved and that's inevitable. So instead, if you're trying to think about evaluating corporate governance, the way that you really judge the quality of the overall corporate governance system is not lack of failures. It's when failures occur, how quickly are they caught? How are they resolved? Do employees even feel comfortable in the first place admitting that a mistake or a failure happened, allowing the governance system to then do what it's designed to do? And then the last step before we pause for questions again is drawing an overall conclusion. Lori, you already alluded to this. This is where I think I was most sad when we did our research, was to see, that people were really passionate about the importance of governance. They could talk just at length about what they wish they were doing. We even asked them to help us brainstorm, how would you go evaluate corporate governance at a peer company? And they had these beautiful ideas, top-down risk-based approach to how they'd evaluate corporate governance at a totally different company. But then doing it at their own company, and we'll talk about challenges in a second, this is one of the big things we saw, is that there's just this disconnect in that final step of drawing an overall conclusion. And that overall conclusion should allow the company to figure out, hey, all of those corporate governance policies, processes, frameworks, relationships, everything that we've picked, we've decided this is what corporate governance looks like at this company. Were those good choices or not good choices? Should we be thinking about things differently? That's what I mean by drawing an overall conclusion. All right, Lori, should we pause there and see if there's any other questions? Or I'd love to hear what questions you had, because I know you peeked at our stuff here too.
Yeah, no, this is great, Lauren. We did have a couple questions about culture in the chat,
Yeah.
so that you brought
Yeah.
that up. And, the culture and tone at the top just seems so critical for corporate governance to, meet the objectives and have that permeate throughout.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, like thinking through this failures and evaluating and reporting, I think when there is kind of a failure at that top, like through management or the board, that's a really tough place, I think, I know you're going to talk about challenges later, but it's
Yeah.
a big challenge for the audit executives to bring
Yeah.
that up to management and to the board. So can you give us a flavor of what you have heard about the difficulties in doing that reporting? And do you think that's part of, this problem of like not getting accurate reporting to
Yeah.
those top levels?
Yeah, so this is where I would ask you, if you were serious about wanting to do a governance evaluation at your company, think really critically about who you are empowering to do that. Those people should have buy-in from senior management and the board at the very beginning. They should know that senior management and the board have set a tone to the evaluation itself of come forward with what you find. And so if you don't get that buy-in from the beginning that they're interested in participating, to your point, Lori, I think it's a dead end evaluation right there. Now, institutionally, there are some interesting things about being a chief audit executive the audience members might not know about. So a chief audit executive is, in my knowledge, the only executive in the entire company that has two purposely distinct reporting lines. The first is called the administrative reporting line, and the second is called the functional reporting line. A chief audit executive, following IIA standards, should have a functional reporting line directly to the board. And it's for this reason that you just talked about. Anything that they find in any of their internal audit engagements that they're doing, they should be able to go directly to the board if needed. Now, a question becomes, what if the board are the bad guys? What if the board isn't doing very well? I don't know how often we'd run into situations where systematically the board isn't doing what they're doing, but we are starting to see court cases for that. I mean, if we take Elon Musk's pay package is a great example of the court stepping in to kind of interpret whether or not they feel like the board was doing their fiduciary duty there. So I don't know how to comment on that. I'm going to leave that one for the legal scholars in the room. So that functional reporting line should give chief audit executive some protection against executive management. But here, I'll give a shout out to some policy making the IIA has been trying to do for years. I don't know if they've done it successfully yet. The administrative reporting line is still a weak spot for them. So administratively, IIA standards say, you know, you need someone who's going to approve your time off. You need someone who's going to assign you an office location and get your computer authorization, truly administrative tasks. But a different research project that I did using some of that original survey data suggests that the power of that chief audit executive's administrative reporting line is more than it probably should be. And so the board, again, needs to make sure that they've set the right tone, that ultimately the board will be the person who's responsible for hiring and firing the chief audit executive, and executive management who has that administrative reporting line is purely there in an administrative way. So those are some things you would have to look out for to make sure your chief audit executive, if they're going to be involved in this, has enough power. We also talked to some companies that said this could be an opportunity for external consulting. So if you're serious about wanting a governance evaluation and you're worried that you don't have the in-house infrastructure to empower someone to feel comfortable bringing forward what they find, it's a great opportunity to bring in an external party. And tell me if I didn't get all that, Lori. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. I'm excited to hear about the challenges, so I'll let you continue.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay. So our third polling question of the day. I'm curious from the audience, first off, which of these challenges they anticipate would be the greatest. So everyone should be able to answer this one, and so if you're an academic, if you're a student, think about, whatever is closest to you that you would be evaluating from a corporate governance perspective. So things that I've kind of highlighted today, and I've had to stay high level kind of because it's just 1 hour. We could, easily dive in on a million specific areas, but I think you get a feel for the idea that this is pretty big, the thing that we're talking about. So are you most worried about resources, lack of budget or expertise wise? Are you worried about that buy-in that we talk about? You shouldn't even start it if you're not going to have interested and willing participants to hear if something's not working well. Are you worried about the fact that at some point you have to pull it all together and write a report, and that thing might feel like it's hard to measure? Or the actual reporting process itself, you're worried that board and senior leaders won't want to hear it. Or maybe you're worried about ownership. Let's say we do this evaluation. What happens next? Who's going to own the idea that we found something in the evaluation process that suggests improvements are needed? Who gets the budget to go fix those things? Who is going to spend time talking to legal counsel and external consultants about what a better choice might be? Oh, interesting. Okay, so the room is least, and maybe these are all weighted heavily and you were really torn here, but relatively least concerned about the actual resources, about split on the idea of either getting the buy-in on the front end or having to do the reporting on the back end. And the largest number of respondents are worried about ownership. So, okay, you're going to do an evaluation. It takes time, it takes resources. What's going to come out of it at the end? All right, so let's talk about what we heard from chief audit executives who've been trying to do this themselves. The first thing that we heard from them is this idea that things are just hard to measure in corporate governance. It requires a lot of judgment if you're going to try to be evaluating governance in substance. So things that are check the box, they won't argue with you on if you come to them and clearly show them that something wasn't authorized. But hey, I don't think you substantively put time into your review before you made that authorization. That requires judgment. And so this comes into, these are kind of all interrelated. You can't really separate any of one of these challenges, but this idea that I just talked about, it's hard to measure, it requires a lot of judgment. You're going to need to lean in on expertise. So that bottom middle one, I'm going to bounce you there for a second. Chief audit executives who are used to forming teams and having teams do the field work, and then the chief audit executive is there to kind of review things after the fact. This will not be an easily outsourced task. The chief audit executive is probably going to have to be the one doing a lot of the different evaluation steps, particularly those related to the boardroom, because they already have that relationship with board members. And then now pivoting you over to the top right, evidence. We heard over and over again this idea that it's easy to find bad, but it's hard to find good. And I mentioned that if you're a good auditor, you're doing both. You're looking for confirmatory evidence and contradictory evidence. So if you found something where there's a clear breakdown in a process, no one came forward, or when they came forward, they were dismissed, or someone purposely pushed something through without the agreed upon governance processes, those are examples of bad governance. That's pretty easy to spot. But a regular thing that we heard participants talk about is, okay, does the lack of failure necessarily mean that governance is good? And the answer is no. You could have just gotten lucky. You could have just gotten lucky that things weren't going that wrong. Now, so those three, I kind of pivot all together. One of the quotes that we heard, and I've kind of got it paraphrased here, is this idea of budget. I was glad to see the audience wasn't too worried about that one. But what they said, what Chief Audit Executive said was, gosh, add this to the 1 million things we're already doing. So they already have full audit workloads for the year. And so if they were really going to dive in on this, they would want the time to do it. And with that, we've already talked about this a lot, but this idea of willing participants, management and the board have to be willing to be open and transparent, or this is a dead end. It's just not going to work. And as far as reporting goes, I've already talked about that idea of the chief audit executive's administrative reporting line, but that's honestly what we heard the most here. So a chief audit executive, some of the ones that I was really inspired by, they would say things like, if you're going to be a chief audit executive, you basically have to be willing to update your resume on a daily basis. You have to be willing to walk away from this company because you have to be willing to do the right thing. We also heard really clever tales of how they do the reporting. So for example, one time a chief audit executive identified something potentially suspicious about another executive, and a board meeting was scheduled to happen very imminently. And so they didn't have a time to call the audit committee chair and talk them through it like they normally would have. So they slid a note on the audit committee's seat at the board meeting, kind of giving them forewarning of, hey, we need to talk before later in the day, when this next meeting is going to happen. We also heard great examples of where audit committees drove that tone at the top for creating that culture of, hey, audit executive, I want you coming to me with what you're finding. They achieve that through things like dinners, calls between meetings, just check-in calls, not just problem calls. But really that relationship between the chief audit executive and the audit committee chair is going to be critical to knowing that you have support when it's time to report something. Lori, were there any that you particularly loved that you want me to dive in on more?
Well, for challenges, I was just thinking through like kind of implications, like what can we do as investors and stakeholders, like how can we address these challenges? And I'm still going back to like the conflict of interest with the board, but I'm glad you mentioned audit committees there because I feel like that seems to be a great opportunity to just have some independent board members really looking out for investors and all stakeholders. And so maybe could you talk a little bit about the role of the audit committee?
Yeah, no, and I love that you brought up that word independent and objective. So that's one of the things I loved about SOX was that audit committee members need to be independent at these publicly traded companies. Audit committees nowadays are doing a lot of things. They're not just looking at financial reporting. A substantial number of audit committees are taking on enterprise risk management. They're taking on cybersecurity oversight. They're taking on sustainability reporting. That positions them very well to perhaps be the group within the board who would take on a governance evaluation. NomGov also is a natural choice here because they are the nominating and governance committee, but they might not have that evaluation mindset that an audit committee would. And so I could also see audit committees and NomGov working together here, independent members, as you mentioned, of the board driving this process. And then it comes down to stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders engaging with these board members will have a sense for if they're fulfilling their duties or not. And so I'm comforted by that hopefully voting would occur. Hopefully some engagement would occur to push out directors, maybe through activism, that you feel like aren't doing their job as an independent board member. Lastly, if we have I think I got maybe 1 minute to squeeze it in, that last study that I talked about here, I will caution from one other set of studies that we did around audit committees evolving responsibilities. when the board is coming up with new things for the audit committee to do, they should be aware that the audit committee is already the workhorse of the board. They are already very overloaded with everything else that they're doing. So they're going to need to be given support if they're going to be asked to take this on. That means, the right to hire consultants, additional maybe team members that have expertise in this area. The other thing is that they should be aware of whether or not the audit committee seems to be a willing participant in taking this on, or if they're just kind of begrudgingly saying, fine, I'm an audit committee member, add it to my plate. Because we found that when you ask audit committee members questions about how they go about overseeing their responsibilities, there's kind of a mindset shift between why they agreed to take something on in the first place. So I think you're going to be wanting to look for audit committee members or non-gov members who are passionate about corporate governance as a theory and as something that can add value to organizations. That's who you want spearheading something like this. And then that means you need to take that into consideration during succession planning when you're thinking about future board members coming on. And then I think I left time for maybe one or two more audience questions. So I'll just leave this slide up with kind of my final thoughts of the day. Lori, anything else from your end?
There is a couple questions in the chat here. Let's see. I don't want to get too political.
Yeah, I know this.
Somewhere
I've
just
been
about,
careful today too. I don't know if you've
just of
noticed.
the reduction, in the workforce at places like IRS and things like that, and how that might be impacting the corporate governance strategies. Like, I guess, have we heard anything from executives or these chief? Probably is a little bit earlier than
It's
we
too
discussed
early
the
for me at
data.
this point. I've got a project where I need to be reaching back out to audit committee members here in the next couple months with some new questions. And it is already top of mind. How do I engage with these audit committee members in a way that is not political? Because that's not the intention here, but
Right.
things are shifting in such a way that it can't help but be intertwined. What's happening on a political risk level is going to impact governance risks, and boards are talking about it. So yeah, but I'll punt that one, Lori. I don't think there's anything else I can add there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. That was wonderful.
Yeah. I'll leave my contact information in case anyone wants to reach out or connect. I would absolutely love to talk about the topic more. Hope it came through. I love this area. I believe that corporate governance genuinely can add value to organizations, and it does not have to be a compliance check the box type of mentality.
Great. I'll jump back in, Lauren. Thank you so much for your comments and your presentation. When we kind of envision this speaker series, trying to reimagine it a little bit and think of it from a interdisciplinary sort of systems-based approach, this is exactly what we were talking about, right? Trying to break down some of these silos. Even just the questions about, well, boy, what would the legal scholars think of this? I think a good way to signal that even though we're talking about the same thing, right, we're coming from these different siloed, these different silos. And so, Lori and I both do work with a behavioral bent to it, but we're coming at this just slightly differently. So great presentation. And I think it's really got us hopefully thinking about not just what these things are, but how do we get underneath to the results and dealing with some of these inevitable failures. And so it was a great presentation, and thank you so much. I just want to remind everybody, we've got two more speakers in our Spring 2025 speaker series. On April 3rd, Andrew Jennings from the Emory Law School will be joining us. He's got a very provocative title for his talk, 4 Strange Things About Corporate Criminals. Okay, so if that doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will. And then April 24th, Allison Taylor of NYU Stern will be here, and she'll be talking about her, I think, acclaimed book at this point called Higher Ground, where she'll be thinking about business and business ethics, and also, again, kind of take an interdisciplinary approach to these topics. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.